Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Metal Slug, released for a lot of systems. Just look at the note on the screen there. It was originally released in arcades, and that version was ported over to the Neo Geo, which is what you're seeing in this video. This is a side-scrolling run-and-gun shooter, originally developed by Nazca Corporation, although SNK now holds the rights to it, that was originally released in 1996 for arcades and later ported to a variety of different systems. As I mentioned before, what you're seeing here is the Neo Geo version. Actually, SNK released a bunch of their old Neo Geo games in a Humble Bundle a while back, and I picked that up, and Metal Slug was part of that bundle, so that's what you're actually seeing in the video. And while people generally call this just plain Metal Slug, and in fact the earlier parts of the series are just named Metal Slug, this one was actually Super Vehicle 001 Metal Slug. And this went on to become a rather long-running series of old-school style run-and-gun shoot-em-ups that have become practically ubiquitous. Most people know what Metal Slug is these days, although not everybody got to play it back in the arcade days. And I believe that something is fundamentally lost if you play the old, originally arcade releases in the Metal Slug series on, say, home consoles or PC or whatever like that. Because unless you're actually familiar with arcade gaming, then you're not going to understand why the game was designed the way it is. And the way it was designed is, well, I'll get to that more in a moment. But let's go ahead and actually start delving into this thing from the presentation on through the gameplay and the story and see what exactly it is and how well it's held up since 1996. Well, as far as presentation goes, there are very, very few games that run on pixel art from the 90s that have held up anywhere near as well as any of the Metal Slug games, and that is precisely because this series, right from this game on up through to the modern day, has always had downright amazing pixel art. I mean, seriously, just look at it. Look at the ridiculous amount of detail in the backgrounds, in the characters, in the animations, just how smooth everything flows together. Even scaled up to 720p when this thing runs in a rather low resolution and it's 4:3 at that, it still looks downright amazing. The only real problem with it, and this is something that also plagued the second game, is that there's so much going on that it actually slows the game down. Sometimes there's just so much going on that it slows the frame rate down to a crawl, even though most of the time the game runs perfectly fine, and in fact the frame rate is very smooth. Now, it's still playable, don't get me wrong, but in a very high-octane action game like this, that's a really big deal. A smooth, very consistent frame rate is something that is absolutely vital in a game where your reaction matters, and in this one, your reaction is pretty much everything. Now, luckily, this really doesn't become a massive problem until they just start throwing a ludicrous amount of stuff at you on screen at once, and they don't really start doing that until really late in the game, so it's something that you can tolerate for most of the time, but it's definitely rather annoying, and it's something that comes up frequently enough that it will actually become a detriment to you. What won't be a detriment to you, however, is the sound design, which generally speaking is very well done. The sound effects are pretty hard-hitting. They're not perfect, don't get me wrong, but they're definitely pretty hard-hitting, well, at least for 1996 arcade game standards anyway. There's an announcer who is speaking English, and it's rather cheesy English. So, for example, whenever you pick up a weapon pickup, he'll say the name of the weapon, and it's just kind of endearingly cheesy. Heavy machine gun. There is a bit more voice acting in the game, but it's mostly relegated to a bunch of screaming and yelling and grunting, as well as "thank you" and this one boss guy that you fight that constantly taunts you as he's annihilating you. Come on, boy! So none of the voice acting is what we would term as good, but it's definitely cheesy and strangely endearing because of that. And then, of course, there is the soundtrack, which I would describe as okay, but for what it is, which is an arcade game soundtrack, it works rather well. It's enough to give that sort of action-packed mood, but it's not necessarily stuff you're going to be listening to outside of the confines of the game. Although, unlike a lot of other games, it's not necessarily a forgettable soundtrack. It's just that you're not going to listen to it outside of the confines of the game. You will be able to instantly recognize it as Metal Slug music, though, so that's always good. And when you bring all that together, you have a game that's certainly dated, but it has stood the test of time, at least as far as presentation goes. But that's not really what matters here. What really matters are the story, or rather lack thereof, and the gameplay. The thing is that Metal Slug never really had much of a story to begin with. It's basically, there's an evil general that's trying to take over the world, and you play as a member of a task force sent to stop him, basically. To that end, if you're player 1, you're Marco, and if you're player 2, you're Tarma, and you both just run around, blast the living crap out of anything in your way, rescue POWs, and try to take down the evil general. There's really not much more to it than that, other than the eponymous Metal Slugs, which are all-terrain tanks that are supposed to be some kind of super weapon. So what ultimately ends up happening is you focus almost entirely on the gameplay, and that's where this game both really shines and is downright infuriating. You see, this being an old-school arcade run-and-gun shoot-'em-up, you run left or right, mostly right, because that's the way the screen will scroll, and you shoot anything in your path. You get a variety of weapons available to you to that end, like the heavy machine gun, rocket launchers, things like that. And of course, you also get grenades that you can throw at things that do a lot more damage than just your basic weaponry. There are a variety of enemies that you'll run into, from your basic soldiers on up through tanks and artillery pieces and APCs and things like that, that you'll just need to blast to hell and back. Along the way, you'll have to contend with some basic platforming and the fact that the controls are all single stick, which means that if you're going to try to aim up, then you actually need to hold the stick up and press the shoot button as well. It's kind of hard to get used to if you're not familiar with that system, but once you get used to it, it's relatively intuitive. The problems come in when you're trying to aim more at a diagonal angle than instead of just going up or to the left or to the right, because if you try to aim diagonally, then it's only when you're moving from a side to up that you're actually able to shoot diagonally. That can be a bit frustrating, but again, once you get used to it, it is fairly easy to work around that. This is helped somewhat by the tanks that you can jump into that can actually shoot diagonally, but even that's somewhat finicky. In fact, the tank controls in general are a bit finicky, but they are definitely usable once you get used to them. And you notice me using that phrase a lot, the phrase getting used to it. And that's kind of the thing with some of these old school arcade games, particularly the ones that were in the actual arcades and required you to put in quarters to play them. Because one thing that you will notice right from the get-go and be plagued by for the rest of the game is the simple fact that the game is ludicrously hard at times. You die in one hit if you're on foot. If you're in a tank, you can take a few hits before that tank gets doomed, and then you have to hop out of the tank and you're pretty much screwed from that point out. But one-hit deaths coupled with basically 3 lives per continue means you're constantly throwing quarters into the machine. Now obviously in the context of an arcade cabinet that makes a whole lot of sense, and it's actually somewhat forgivable. Pretty much all of those old school arcade games were just brutally difficult because of the simple fact that they wanted to get as much money out of you as possible by you putting in quarters for continues. And if you never managed to experience the arcade culture, then you don't really understand what it was like getting good at a game like this. If you managed to get through the entirety of a lot of these old school arcade games on a single play, then that was incredibly impressive, and you were basically the star of the arcade. These days we look at something like this and go, oh, whatever, I've got infinite continues, or I can put it on free play, it's no big deal. But back then, that was a pretty huge deal. And I readily admit that I am downright terrible at this game. A lot of you people who are actually big fans of Metal Slug are probably screaming at a lot of the performance that you're seeing on the screen, but that's really not the point. The point is that this is a game from a completely bygone era. And I have to wonder how it is going into a game like this if you've never played an arcade game before. Because if you haven't, then you don't understand what they're like. You don't understand that a lot of them are downright brutally difficult for no other reason than they want your money. And then you run into a game like Metal Slug where you're dying constantly because you, of course, die in one hit, but you also have just tons of stuff happening on screen at once, to the point where at times it's actually kind of hard to keep track of it all. And you're dealing with boss enemies that are downright cheap. But here's the thing, that's pretty much the main draw of this game. It is old school arcade run and gun shooter goodness. And if you don't like that, then you're not going to be able to get anything out of Metal Slug at all. I mean, we're talking about a game whose original control scheme was like what you modern gamers would know as a fight stick. For those of us who did play arcade games back in the day, just normal arcade game controls. We're used to that sort of thing. And playing it on a gamepad really doesn't do it the same kind of justice that you would get from playing it on a full-on arcade setup. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly playable on a gamepad and it will work just fine, it's not quite the same as playing it on a proper arcade machine. It's sort of like if you play flying games or space flight games or things of that nature and you don't use a joystick. It's just not quite the same. It doesn't feel quite right. And even though you may still have quite a lot of fun with it, and in fact I did still have quite a lot of fun with it, even though it can be incredibly frustrating to play this thing because, let's face it, one-hit deaths are kind of bullshit. But anyway, you just have this feeling in your gut that it's just not quite 100%. It may be 95% or even 98 or 99%, but it's still just missing that special something that an actual arcade machine brings to the table. And that's something that, unless you actually have played an arcade machine proper, then you just don't really understand. And you'll probably think I'm just being nostalgic, but seriously, if you do get a chance, go ahead and actually compare the experience of playing this on a proper arcade machine versus, say, playing the Steam release of it. And you'll notice they definitely feel different. And that's the thing, with a lot of these old school arcade games, they really all come down to the proper feel of the gameplay, the proper flow. And that's something that Metal Slug still holds up on to this day. It still has a really nice game flow to it. Even though it is frustrating, even though it is brutally difficult, it's really the animations, the punchy sound effects, the sense of humor that the game has. This is a really lighthearted game, even though it's got a lot of carnage going on in it. But it's just silly. It knows exactly what it is, which is a pretty mindless run-and-gun shoot-'em-up game, and it just rolls with it. It tries to make you have as fun a time as possible, while still also being a quarter-devouring monster. And if that's your kind of thing, then Metal Slug definitely fits the bill. It still holds up to this day, although it has aged pretty considerably. And I think that's ultimately the biggest problem with a game like Metal Slug. It is, again, from a bygone era. Arcades really aren't a thing in the West anymore, and even though they are still in Japan to some degree, that's actually becoming more of a past thing as well. So if you don't understand the mindset of the era, if you don't understand what they were working with, and you treat it like Joe Schmo, the average Call of Duty player, does, then you'd probably think that the game is just complete BS, and you'd get angry at it, and you'd act like it's the worst thing in the universe. But for what it is, which is an old-school arcade run-and-gun shooter, it's one of the finest examples of the genre. Certainly not perfect, not by a long shot, but well worth trying if this is your kind of thing, or if you are looking to get into this kind of thing, then you might as well start with the original Metal Slug, because as far as run-and-gun shooters go, it is still fairly easy to get into this, at least compared to the later Metal Slug games, which were actually quite a bit more difficult. Just know what you're getting yourself into, and understand that you're going to have to be constantly hammering the fire button in this thing, which gets pretty tiring. It is actually kind of exhausting to play Metal Slug for a long period of time. But given that this was meant for maybe half-hour play sessions at most, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. I will have a link in the video description box where you can pick this up on Steam if you're interested. Thanks for watching.